I confess, bowing here, I find my rest. Without you, I fall apart. You're the one that guides my heart. Love, I need you. Oh, I need you. Every hour I need you. My one defense, my righteousness. Oh, love, how I need you. Where sin runs deep, your grace is more. Where grace is found is where you are. And where you are, love, I am free. Holiness is Christ indeed. Love, I need you. Oh, I need you. Every hour I need you. My one defense, my righteousness. Oh, love, how I need you. So teach my soul to rise to you. When temptation comes my way, when I cannot stand, I fall on you. Jesus' life showed us the way. Love, I need you. Oh, I need you. Every hour I need you. For our defense and righteousness. Oh, love, how I need you. Love, you need me. Oh, you need me. Every hour you need me. For our defense and righteousness. Oh, love, how you need me. No justice, no peace.
Any Common Desolation by Ellen Bass. Any common desolation can be enough to make you look up at the yellowed leaves of the apple tree, the few that survived the rains and frost, shot with late afternoon sun. They glow a deep orange gold against a blue so sheer a single bird would rip it like silk. You may have to break your heart, but it isn't nothing to know even one moment alive. The sound of an oar in an oarlock, or a ruminant animal tearing grass, the smell of grated ginger, the ruby neon of the liquor store sign. Warm socks. You remember your mother, her precision a ceremony, as she gathered the white cotton, slipped it over your toes, drew up the heel, turned the cuff. A breath can uncoil as you walk across your own muddy yard. The Big Dipper pouring night down over you, and everything you dread, all you can't bear, dissolves, and like a needle slipped into your vein, that sudden rush of the world.
Happy Sunday, Greater Purpose Community Church. You are welcomed, you are affirmed, and you are loved at this table that is set for kindred shakers of empire, the fiercely hospitable, and devout arbiters of goodwill toward humanity. We got a couple of announcements. First off, the last slide of this video is going to have our Zoom room chat number for our cocktail hour. Please join us. We would love to see you during this time of social distancing, and you can get to know some folks if you haven't had the opportunity to, and within our online community. Also, we are not collecting tithes and offerings right now. Too many people are hurting. And speaking of which, if you have a need, if you're hurting, put in the comment section of this video your need and your Venmo ID if you feel comfortable. In church, if you feel led, please help meet those needs during this time of crisis. Also, get you a grain product like a cracker or a piece of bread. Get you some juice or some wine. Moms, I know you got wine at that house right now because them kids still driving you crazy. Set it to the side, and at the end of this video, we're going to have communion led by Maria today. We're going to take that together. And also, please do us a favor right now. I think somewhere below my finger, if I'm guesstimating correctly, is a watch party button. Click that, start a watch party so your friends and your family can witness a church that is not afraid to stand on the front line of justice and the right side of history, because regrettably the church is not doing that in a time where it's desperately needed. Speaking of which, we don't shy away from that, right? We dive right into justice, and we embrace the revolution wholeheartedly at this church. But that is triggering sometimes for folks because we talk about some heavy things. And if you need to step away at any point, we more than understand. So don't feel obligated to stay. If something is painful, if you need to take it in stride, that's more than acceptable. How I manage to do this is I often watch the sermon with a adult beverage. So you do so as well. Get you one, kick your feet up. Who's going to judge you? You're at home, right? All right. So I do not have to tell you here at Greater Purpose that we teach that the Bible, at its core, depicts socio-political conflicts that arose during the times of the ancients. It's much more practical and less spiritual than people think it is. And this anthology we call the Bible describes combating ideals and combating political concepts that is why much of the scripture appears to contradict other verses within the biblical narrative. But for those of you that may be new to attending our service, know that because of the highly political nature of the scriptures, we do not shy away from engaging in dialogue about politics and American culture. We do not shy away from engaging in conversations about morality and culture at this church at all. Because despite the claims of many ministers on the left and on the right, the Bible is extremely political. In fact, political and moral discourse is one of the few consistent defining characteristics of the sacred text from cover to cover. So again, if you're new here, in context, the Bible is political, and the erroneous manifestations of modern theology tend to mystify certain elements of Scripture that in context were far from overly spiritual stories. Which is why our message is important, because proper context would make the Bible far more interesting and even more sensible if we can kind of deconstruct these overly spiritual constructs of the church, and if we can deconstruct these mystical stories within modern faith communities and dissect the political elements that were meant to be communicated and associated with certain text. Some of the greatest atrocities in history have emerged from theology that is far from contextual. For example, much of the populace of the modern adherents of the three Abrahamic faiths, which is Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, much of them assume that there's something spiritually powerful and significant about the region that is described in ancient Israel. There's something that is mystical about that land. And of course, we believe all people are sacred, and the people are certainly sacred, but they believe something is spiritually significant about that geographic location. And the scriptures of the Abrahamic faith certainly each possess text that each have a claim that this designated geography belonged to their associated faith. Like they all have a claim to parts of that region. Because these texts are often taken out of context, there have been centuries long conflicts and holy wars that were fought over this section of land. And it's odd that this warfare is still ongoing because this section of land, if you're from the outside looking in, it's seemingly pretty insignificant geographically because it's so small. This region is no bigger than Rhode Island. It's tiny. And the outcomes of these battles for dominance over this region have been devastating, and the vast majority of history's most villainous factions fighting for that land have identified as Christian. So don't hear what I'm not saying. I'm not trying to trash the other Abrahamic faiths. We are the biggest culprit of crimes against humanity in that region for sure. And yet, there is still this ongoing belief that these lands should be conquered by the Abrahamic faith because these borders are understood to be spiritually powerful and significant. Now, on the contrary, in regards to what historians have actually been able to understand about this geographic location, spiritual significance was likely not the actual reason for constant campaigns to dominate this area. Even if sacred writings do make that claim, that's not why these lands were so viciously fought for. During the time that the scriptures were written and compiled, the reason Israel was constantly sought after made total sense from a strategic plan and a strategic point. It had very little sacred significance. This area in the kingdom of ancient Israel was a highly utilized trade route perfectly located between ancient metropolises. Meaning if you wanted to take your spices or your gold or your linens or your fragrances to market in thriving ancient imperial strongholds that yielded both high volumes of demand and generated substantial profits and sales in the ancient Middle East and Africa, you would have to caravan through ancient Israel. Israel was a central location for lucrative enterprises in every cardinal direction. Anywhere you went, there was money to be made. And during times of peace, this was quite profitable for whoever was in a position of political dominance over Israel. But this was a double-edged sword, pun intended, because during times of military conflicts, this region was often fought for because of its geographic and political advantages. So if you've ever seen the Star Wars prequels, as terrible as they were, I say this as a nerd, right? These films were fairly accurate in one respect. They were fairly accurate in depicting common and antiquated military strategies of warfare. The Trade Federation, the bad guys in the Star Wars films and these prequels, they grew in prominence progressively, not necessarily by having a formidable military, but by gradually and surgically seizing and or impairing trade routes of economic prowess in the Republic. So think of Israel as kind of like a real-life version of the planet Naboo in Star Wars, except not terrible because Israel didn't have Jar Jar Binks. No, I will not stop using nerd references. Stop asking. I have spoken. All right? It's going to happen. It's what I do. So the land of Israel was often sought by imperial entities all the way up to and all the way through the Middle Ages. And this is why we see multiple entities in power throughout the anthology of sacred writings that make up the Bible. You've got the Egyptians, the Babylonians, the Amorites, the Israelites, the Greeks, and the Romans. And these are just some of the ruling authorities that conquered this region during the time periods depicted throughout both Old and New Testaments. And today we're going to talk about some of the narratives in the Hebrew Bible, specifically Joshua and Judges, that described a moment of Israelite conquest in this region, supposedly. I'm going to dive right in. So the book of Joshua has two accounts in which the city of Jericho is conquered by God, who mystically destroyed the structural safety measures of this city and surrounding cities. And this divine intervention is initiated by the obedience of the Israelites. The Israelites followed God's command to march around the city, and then God supposedly would destroy the wall. And in the story, God did destroy the wall. Now, one account of Joshua involves Joshua marching around the city 7 times, and another involves priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant around Jericho 13 times. So there's 2 separate accounts of this conquest of Jericho. So scholars have concluded that the story of Jericho in Joshua is likely 2 separate accounts that eventually at some point in history got woven together. Now, after God tears down the walls of Jericho, things get really dark because a clear genocide follows suit in the scripture. But I want you to stick with me because there is so much more here historically and theologically than meets the eye. And it's something that really changed my perspective about the book of Joshua. Joshua 11 says this, "And they put to the sword all who were in it, utterly destroying them. There was no one left who breathed. And he burned Hazor with fire, and all the towns of those kings and all their kings Joshua took and struck them with the edge of the sword, utterly destroying them, as Moses, the servant of the Lord, had commanded Joshua to do. But Israel burned none of the towns that stood on mounds except Hazor, which Joshua did burn. All the spoils of these towns and the livestock the Israelites took for their booty." The Bible says booty. It's my favorite word in the Bible. "But all the people they struck down with the edge of the sword until they had destroyed them. And they did not leave anyone who breathed. As the Lord had commanded his servant Moses, so Moses commanded Joshua, and so Joshua did. Joshua left nothing undone. And all that the Lord had commanded Moses, Joshua did." So there are a couple things here to notice. One, that's kind of a horrific story, right? Stay with me. Stay with me. Basically, the first thing to notice is this text assigns the reason for the victory at Jericho to Yahweh, to the Israelite God. And this book makes it clear that without Yahweh's help, the horrific genocide depicted in these scriptures would not have been possible without God's involvement. And this has always been a major issue for me theologically. I've been familiar with the story for a while. If you're just hearing it for the first time, I'm pretty sure it's an issue with you. But again, stay with me. Luckily for us, there is very little to no evidence at all that this conquest actually happened historically. And there's very little evidence that it makes sense theologically, because some of the lands that are said to have been conquered in the book of Joshua are later in the Bible. They are said to have not been conquered or conquered later. Even in the book of Joshua, it contradicts itself about what regions were conquered and who did the conquering as we read on. And archaeology certainly does not back up the claims in Joshua and Judges that these regions were taken forcefully. Some regions described in Joshua had no evidence of ever being occupied at all, and other areas that the book of Joshua states were conquered have no evidence that they were ever significantly attacked by an opposing military force at all, or at least not during the historical period in which the Hebrew Bible describes these events. Now, you might be asking yourself, how can scholars know this? Archaeologists can actually measure military conquest by viewing what's called a tell of an ancient city. In this region and during this time, when a city was sacked by an opposing military, it was leveled entirely and a new city was built on the remains and the rubble and the destruction. So this meant that cities that were conquered throughout centuries would be built on higher elevations because it was conquered, and new civilizations would rise and then they would fall, and the hill that a new community was built on would grow naturally. So the higher elevation that a city was built on, this mound, would become, the more times archaeologists can conclude that it was conquered, it was destroyed, and another city was resurrected on top of it. And this is partially how archaeologists can estimate approximately how deep to excavate a site for information specific to certain peoples. So historians concluded that many of the regions that are said to have been conquered by Joshua have no evidence for conquest during that time period. In fact, archaeologists found that there weren't even walls in Jericho during the time Joshua described these events unfolding. So what's happening here? Joshua and Judges describe the inception of the kingdom of Israel by military action. Now remember, up to this point, the Israelites have been nomadic. They've been traveling around. But now we're going to see the kingdom of Israel, these two kingdoms, first come into being. But in reality, these horrific events and acts of genocide within Joshua and Judges are a literary tool that does not depict the actual origins of the formation of the kingdom of Israel. Scholars maintain that Israel came about not by invasion, but by one of three possibilities. The kingdom of Israel may have been founded by a group of migrants that eventually conquered the land after they had already settled in it for a good deal of time. You see, the possession of this land was always in flux. We just talked about that. Militaries were constantly trying to conquer this land because then they could have more economic power in negotiating or defeating their enemy. So it was constantly in flux. So some scholars claim that during one of these moments of weakened ownership, perhaps during a military campaign, this loosely held region made it possible for migrants of tribes to band together and seize control of this land. Now, the major problem with that theory is that there's no archaeological evidence to support this claim that even a band of tribes came together to conquer lands. So that can't even hold up historically. But there is evidence of an early Israelite stronghold described in Joshua, but the excavation of this site showed that the settlement was a new settlement. It was not a city that had been conquered by the Israelites. There was no tell that this settlement was built on. This was a brand new thing that was going on. And this indicates that the kingdom of Israel likely started out as two other possibilities. The first possibility is that Israel was an uprising of rebels against the empire of which they were citizens. And I'm sure a lot of people at this church like that possibility, right? Like, because we tend to look at ourselves as revolutionaries. And then, according to this theory, the Israelites kind of moved out of Canaanite strongholds that they were a part of to start new societies. Because unlike the Canaanite societies, the one thing that they discovered at this site of the oldest site for ancient Israelites was that there was no pig bones whatsoever. Other than that, everything else was extremely similar, but there was no pig bones. So this indicates that they were following the ancient Israelite diet. But eventually, their movement grew, and according to this theory, the Israelites were able to overthrow cultural and governing authorities from within that region. Okay? There's also another possibility, and that possibility is that the formation of ancient Israel was a progressive mindset that gradually began to assimilate from within Canaanite culture slowly over time. So in this view, the kingdom of Israel was not established by military conquest of foreign invaders. It was not established by an internal revolution, which I know we like the sound of, but rather in this view, the kingdom of Israel was first founded as a cultural evolution from an existing society, progressing in their values. So these literary moments of the scriptures where Israel put their enemies to the sword to take their land from their enemies were likely narrative exaggerations used as a tool to communicate the author's belief that the former society was culturally inferior to the new society that was the society that the author was likely a part of. And this is why the author used myths claiming that God commanded this divinely appointed extermination of the culture that resided in the land prior to Joshua's conquest. It's not a literal tale. Is it still terrible theology? Sure. Did these horrific events actually happen? Not likely. So there is some good news with that. Now, although this artistic methodology is not wholesome at all, it is superior to American history, where our leaders like George Bush and Dick Cheney and Donald Trump invoke the name of God to commit actual crimes against humanity. And this is a great stopping point for us this week because we need to talk about what's going on in Minnesota. We need to discuss this. This week I saw many spiritual folks, some of which were spiritual leaders, frowning upon the explosive protests that erupted due to the murder of George Floyd by a racist piece of shit cop. And many of these people that were chastising these protesters and activists, they were Christians, and some were even progressive Christians. And I want to say this to that group. Look, you can make your case that you don't agree with certain methods of property destruction during a protest. But what you cannot do, logically, is equate property destruction to violence, or use the Bible to oppose moments of revolt that elected to use methods of property destruction. Look, Jesus flipped tables of money changers because temple exchange rates were lining the pockets of a corrupt empire, and they were hurting the poor financially, the poor that already had a boot on their neck during the time of Christ. The triumphant entry of Christ involved Jesus instructing his disciples to steal the Roman prefect's colt that was used in a parade meant to symbolically represent Rome's military might. I mean, Jesus basically stole the mayor's limousine. And that's not all. The cursing of the fig tree is a metaphorical flag burning. The Last Supper was a protest in itself because it was a Passover meal that did not use sacrificial meat purchased from the temple, because the temple was being taxed by Rome, and the earliest followers of Christ, these Jewish followers of Christ, did not want to line the pockets of Rome. Therefore, they didn't pay the temple for their sacrificial feast. So based on this biblical evidence, we can see that yes, Jesus was nonviolent. Of course he was. But did Jesus commit or endorse subversive acts of property destruction and acts that weren't always warm and fuzzy? Absolutely. Because biblical ethics make it clear that lives are more valuable than property. Hell, we can't even use American history to oppose property destruction, by the way. Does the Boston Tea Party ring a bell? I mean, I'll give you a hint. It wasn't a tea party. There wasn't a lot of crumpets going around at that party. There was a lot of tea going into the water as an act of protest, though. Property destruction. Look, this is my point. If we are more angry at marginalized folks being so fed up with their people being murdered that they burn down an empty Target or even an empty police station than we are about the police targeting people of color, then we're part of the damn problem. Especially if we try to use scripture to make that point. Look, both testaments of this book, right, Old and New, are an anthology of revolutions and the documented plights of brutalized people. The essence of the gospel was that Jesus was leading a nonviolent uprising, and whatever logic you use to object to property destruction, all right, whatever objections you have to that, they cannot accurately emerge from within the gospel of Jesus. You can't extract your position from this. It's not there. Because there is a good to fair chance that Jesus would have danced on the ashes of burned buildings, whether they were government or corporate, that symbolize systems that cause, perpetuate, and profit from injustice. So make your case, by all means, and I'll make mine. But do not twist my faith to aid the oppressor by hindering the activist, because the gospel of Jesus is a blueprint for neither. And until next week, may the revolution of Jesus go with you wherever it may send you. May it guide you in healing this wasteland and protect you through the storm. May it lead you through the world seeking the justice that it demands for you. And may it bring you home preparing to continue love's mission beyond your doors. Grace and justice to you. I used to say grace and peace, but you know what? No justice, no peace. See you next week.
Hi, this is Maria. Before I start, I want to give a little backstory. I'm currently in the middle of transitioning my housing situation, and as you can imagine, that takes a lot of work these days to make sure everyone involved is safe. And a part of that, I'm lucky and privileged enough to be able to house sit for a friend for 5 days. And I just have never been so thankful. I have never had so much silence and so much space to myself in the last 2 months. One of the first things I did when I got here was to take a shower to make sure that I was not bringing the virus in on my body into their house. And I was just overwhelmed with gratitude in the shower. Just for flowing water and just for a place that I could fully relax and let my brain rest. And I thought to myself, this is what I imagine coming out of this whole pandemic is going to feel like in a very minute way. And I gotta tell you, friends, like, it was, for me, it was a lot. It was heavy and emotional, but it was also magical. It was also, I felt so much appreciation and gratitude for things I've taken for granted. A space for myself, a shower, safety, just some real basics. When Christopher asked me to do communion, I pretty quickly said, no, that's not my thing. I don't know. Yeah, it's just not my thing. And of course, then something happened that made me understand the situation that Jesus was in, maybe. And as I was in the shower, I was just thinking what it must have been like for them to sit with their friends and family and break bread and think about their life and their coming death and sacrifice and betrayal and what that transition might have been like. And I imagine that they had a lot of gratitude. I imagine it was really heavy as well, and emotional, and perhaps magical. I've been thinking about sacrifice also lately, and that I think we're all making sacrifices right now, and for each person they're big, and I think that makes each of them really worthy in their own sense. So with that in mind, I want to lead us in communion today. On the night Jesus was betrayed, they sat down with their friends and family and broke bread, and they said, "This is my body given for you. Take and eat." And they took wine or grape juice or whatever liquid and said, "This is my blood shed for you. Pour it the fuck out in remembrance of me." I want to invite you all now to do the same, to take the bread, drink your drink, pour it out for Jesus, pour it out for you and your loved ones, and know that we're going to get to the other side of this. And it's going to be different and a lot and magical.